The United Nations Security Council is often described as the world's most powerful decision-making body. When it comes to international peace and security, it has the authority to pass binding resolutions, impose sanctions, authorize the use of force, and demand ceasefires in times of conflict. For many people around the world, the UNSC is supposed to be the place where the international community comes together to confront crises. But when it comes to Gaza, one question keeps surfacing over and over again. Why does the United States keep blocking resolutions at the Security Council? To understand this pattern, we have to look at both history and politics. Since the establishment of Israel in 1948, the U.S. has been its most powerful ally. Over the decades, Washington has provided Israel with billions of dollars in military aid, diplomatic support, and advanced weaponry. This close partnership has translated into consistent backing at the United Nations. Whenever a resolution critical of Israel comes up, especially in the Security Council, the U.S. is almost always the one country that vetoes it, often standing against the majority of the international community. This is not a new phenomenon but rather a continuation of a long-standing policy that dates back to the Cold War. One of the key features of the Security Council is the veto power. 5 permanent members, China, Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France hold the ability to block any resolution regardless of how much global support it has. For Gaza and the wider Israel-Palestine conflict, this mechanism has allowed the United States to shield Israel from binding UN action again and again. Even when 14 out of 15 members vote in favor of a ceasefire or a humanitarian pause, the American veto alone is enough to kill the measure. Critics argue this has turned the Security Council into a paralyzed institution, unable to act when action is most urgently needed from the American perspective. Officials often justify their use of the veto by saying that many of these resolutions are biased against Israel or fail to address the role of Hamas and other armed groups. U.S. representatives frequently insist that Israel has the right to defend itself against rocket attacks and terrorism. They argue that one-sided resolutions that only condemn Israel ignore the security threats faced by Israelis. Washington usually pushes for wording that also acknowledges Israel's right to self-defense, and if that language isn't included, the U.S. tends to block the resolution altogether. Too many governments around the world, however, this justification looks like an excuse to give Israel a blank check for its military actions in Gaza. The design of American foreign policy toward the region is influenced by several factors. One of the most important is domestic politics. Within the United States, support for Israel runs deep across both major parties, though in recent years there has been more debate within the Democratic Party. Pro-Israel lobbying groups, most famously AIPAC, wield significant influence in Washington. Politicians are well aware that taking a strong pro-Israel stance often helps secure political support and campaign funding. This domestic political reality makes it very difficult for any U.S. administration to adopt a position at the UN that would be perceived as abandoning Israel. Even presidents who have clashed with Israeli leaders privately, such as Barack Obama with Benjamin Netanyahu, still use the veto to protect Israel at the Security Council. Another layer to this is strategic. Israel is considered America's closest ally in the Middle East, a region where the U.S. has long had both economic and security interests. Maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge is seen in Washington as a way of ensuring that American influence in the region remains strong. By blocking UNSC resolutions, the U.S. not only shields Israel diplomatically, but also sends a clear signal that it stands firmly behind its ally. This message is intended not only for Israel but also for adversaries like Iran, as well as for other partners in the region. In other words, American vetoes are not only about Gaza, they are also about broader geopolitics and maintaining the balance of power in the Middle East. Critics, however, argue that the unique selling point of the United Nations, the idea that it represents the will of the international community, is undermined by the way the U.S. uses its veto. On Gaza, where humanitarian crises have reached catastrophic levels with thousands of civilians killed and millions living under blockade, the paralysis of the Security Council makes the UN appear toothless. Human rights organizations often point out that Washington's vetoes give Israel effective impunity, allowing it to continue military operations without fear of international sanctions. This damages the credibility of both the UN and the U.S. on the global stage, fueling accusations of double standards. For example, the U.S. has condemned Russian vetoes related to Ukraine, saying they prevent accountability. But in Gaza, Washington is doing the very same thing. Preventing international consensus from turning into action. There is also a legal dimension. International law, particularly the Geneva Conventions, emphasizes the protection of civilians during conflict. Many legal scholars argue that Israel's blockade of Gaza and its repeated military campaigns raise serious questions about violations of international humanitarian law. When the U.S. blocks Security Council resolutions calling for investigations, ceasefires, or accountability, it is seen as actively obstructing international law. This adds to global frustration, especially in the global South, where countries already view the international system as biased toward Western powers. By repeatedly shielding Israel, Washington reinforces the perception that the rules of the game only apply when they serve Western interests. For everyday viewers, it can feel confusing. On the one hand, the U.S. frequently emphasizes its commitment to human rights, international order, and the rule of law. On the other hand, when it comes to Gaza, Washington uses its veto power more than any other country to prevent collective action. This contradiction is why so many people ask why the U.S. keeps blocking UNSC resolutions. The short answer is a mix of strategic interests, domestic politics, and a long-standing alliance. But the long answer reveals the complexity of how power works in international institutions and how the principles of fairness and justice often take a back seat to political convenience. It's also important to note the performance of the Security Council itself. The Council was designed in 1945 after World War II, when the victors set up a system to prevent future conflicts. But its architecture, especially the veto, reflects a world that no longer exists. The U.S. use of the veto on Gaza is just one example of how outdated this structure has become. Similar frustrations arise when Russia vetoes resolutions on Ukraine, or when China blocks measures on Myanmar. In all these cases, the veto has been used to protect allies or national interests at the expense of global consensus. Gaza is a stark reminder of how the system, designed to uphold peace, can instead perpetuate conflict by preventing collective action. Over the years, various attempts have been made to reform the Security Council. Some proposals suggest limiting the use of the veto in cases of mass atrocities. Others suggest expanding the membership to include more countries from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, so that the Council better reflects today's world. But these reforms have never materialized because the very countries that hold veto power, including the U.S., are unlikely to give up their privilege. In this way, the issue of Gaza is not just about one conflict, but also about the very structure of global governance and the imbalance of power at its core for Palestinians. The impact of U.S. vetoes is direct and devastating. Each blocked resolution means no binding call for a ceasefire, no protection from bombardment, no accountability for violations. It means continued suffering in Gaza, where hospitals run out of supplies, electricity is scarce, and basic necessities are restricted. For Israelis, the U.S. veto is seen as reassurance that their closest ally will always have their back, even when global opinion is largely against them. This dual reality fuels resentment and deepens mistrust, making the prospects for peace even more distant. The symbolism of America standing alone in the council chamber cannot be ignored either. Time and again, images circulate of 14 countries voting in favor of a ceasefire while the U.S. raises its hand in opposition. To many people worldwide, this symbolizes unilateralism, hypocrisy, and disregard for human suffering. Yet in Washington, policymakers see it as necessary to protect a vital ally and preserve influence in the Middle East. This gap between perception and intention highlights the deep divide in how the world views the U.S. role in the Israel-Palestine conflict. At the same time, there are cracks emerging within the United States itself. Public opinion surveys in recent years show growing divisions, particularly among younger Americans and within the Democratic Party, about U.S. support for Israel. Protests, academic debates, and grassroots campaigns are challenging the traditional bipartisan consensus. Some lawmakers have openly questioned the wisdom of using the veto so reflexively. While these shifts have not yet translated into policy changes at the Security Council, they suggest that the debate in the U.S. is evolving. Whether that will eventually alter Washington's approach to Gaza remains an open question. When considering the unique selling points of this issue for a broader audience, one of the most striking is how it exposes the contradictions of global power. The Gaza conflict is not just a regional issue. It is a lens through which we can see the broader failures of international governance. The Security Council's inability to act highlights the gap between ideals and realities in international politics. The U.S. role demonstrates how even a country that champions democracy and human Rights can undermine those very values when strategic interests are at stake. And for viewers, understanding why the US keeps blocking resolutions on Gaza is also about understanding how the world order works or doesn't work in practice. Ultimately, the American veto on Gaza is about much more than a diplomatic maneuver. It is about history, domestic politics, alliances, and global strategy. It is about the limits of the United Nations and the frustrations of the international community. And most of all, it is about the lives of millions of people who remain caught in a cycle of violence and impunity. Because the most powerful country in the world continues to place politics above principle.